presenting a portion of a project I've been working on, and Wilson actually helped me with a lot of the initial data cleaning and coding when he was my RA, so I wanted to give him a shout out. But it's titled, at least for now, Single Moms and Family Photos, and I'm looking at the effects of gender and parental status on evaluations of candidates. So we'll start out with some good news. In the current Congress, we have record highs for the number of women in both the House of Representatives, and I don't have the Senate featured here. So currently, 29% of the House is comprised of women. So that's good, it's a record, but it's still well below the 50% we would want to see gender representation in Congress. In this first graph, I also want to point out the discrepancy in partisanship. So of the women who are in Congress, it's much more likely that they are Democrats than Republicans. In this Congress, but also you can see the blue versus the red historically in this graph. So this support for women candidates among Democrats we see in the general public as well. So this is a 2018 poll from Pew Research Center, and we see that when respondents were asked if there were too few women serving in high political office in the country today, that Democrats and those who lean Democrat are much more likely than Republicans to agree with this statement, to think that there's a problem in the gender representation in Congress. So it's around 80% versus 30%. So this support among Democrats for women candidates, we see it in polling, but it's also been confirmed in multiple political science surveys. But of course, even though there's this stated support, there's this gap in leadership that remains. So why is there this gap? I believe our next panelist will probably address a lot of these issues as well. But women candidates, they face gendered campaign environments. So they face stereotypes of what a leader looks like when they campaign. And women candidates have to decide how they'll deal with that, how they will shape their strategy to put them in the best possible light to where their constituents will vote for them. One of the ways they do that is they deal with and decide how they will present their families while campaigning. So if they have children, are they going to talk about their children in their campaign speeches? Are they going to have their families go to campaign events? Will they talk about them in their advertisements? This is obviously a very personal decision, but it's also can be either a strategic plus or a negative. So there's evidence that some maternal appeals can benefit some women candidates, and particularly women from traditional campaign environments, or rather traditional family structures, family environments. So the puzzle that I will quickly discuss today is looking at this disconnect. We'll be focusing on Democrats for the purpose of today's presentation, and we see that although there's this high percentage of support, of stated support among Democrats, this gender gap in leadership remains. And there are, of course, many, many reasons for this gender gap in leadership, but I will be addressing one small potential piece of this puzzle, looking at which women that Democrats want to serve them in Congress. So to do this, I conducted a survey experiment in 2022 where I varied both the gender and the parental status of these fictional candidates. So this woman is actually, at least a few years ago, was a state representative in Massachusetts, but for the purposes of my project, she is a fictional candidate for the US House. So all of the respondents, they read this bio with some basic information, the age, the political party, prior political experience of this candidate, and what I did is I varied the name and thus the gender of the candidate. And then I also varied whether or not the candidate was single with a child or married with children. And what I did is I looked at a number of outcomes, a number of different ways that respondents, potential voters, could evaluate the candidates. And I'll present just a couple of those today. So first, I looked at, and asked respondents after they saw their fictional candidate, the extent to which they agreed that the candidate is qualified to run for this office. And what you'll see here are average responses, average evaluations for men on the left and women on the right on these different treatments. So the married man, the single man, the married woman, and the single woman. And throughout my results, I find a preference, particularly among Democratic women, for the married woman candidate. So you see here in a comparison to both the married man and the single man, Democratic women prefer, they say that the married woman is more qualified. So interestingly, I didn't see the same preference for the single woman. Among men, I didn't find significant results for this measure. I also analyzed a statement of, do you think Congress would be better off with more people like this candidate in office? And again, among Democratic women, I found a preference for the married woman candidate. This time, a statistically significant difference in responses when they saw the married woman in comparison to the married man. Again, single women, single moms didn't get the same bump, the same preference. So overall, even though I could just present a few of the outcomes today, I found a desire for change and representation among Democrats. So in each of my outcomes, the candidate that was most negatively rated was the candidate that looked most like the average member of Congress. So in this case, male, married, and all of my candidates for this project were white. So I did find a preference for women candidates, but it's a certain type of woman candidate. Married women were preferred, and I didn't find the same bump, the same preference for single women candidates. So my conclusion is that I found evidence that family arrangement matters for women candidates. It can serve as either a plus, something they can campaign on and might be rewarded for, or it can serve as a barrier, both to entry into the political realm, but also potentially in how they are evaluated as they run for office. That's what I have.
All right, thank you very much.
Oh, yep.
Thank you. All right, thank you everyone again for being here. Let's get out of here. And thanks to Brian and Rockefeller staff for organizing this wonderful event. I'm Dina Refki. I am the director of the Center for Women in Government and Civil Society, and as the name suggests, we really care and are concerned for women's political participation, for women's political leadership, and we do research on these aspects. So this work that I'm going to talk about has been published already this year. So the citation is at the end. I'll share it with you. Hopefully you can take a look, because the voices of the women who were involved in this research is only in the article, but for the sake and the interest of time, and the importance of stories that Virginia talked about, and the importance of the lived experience of women is very important. So this work looked at the making of women politicians. So basically the question that we ask, what enables women to continue on their quest to run for office, and what enables them to not drop out of that fight? So as you all know, women face unprecedented barriers and challenges as they run for office, and these are all documented in the literature. They face double standards and stereotypes, so they are always held at a higher threshold of competence. They are always subjected to scrutiny when they run for office. They face lack of respect, so they're having a hard time being taken seriously when they run for office. Work-family conflict, low self-efficacy. Women feel that they are not confident to run for office. They don't have the competency to run for office, and they feel the imposter syndrome. Also, research documented the low levels of ambition, although the research is mixed on that. Some say that, yes, women have lower levels of ambition to run for office, but others say that is not true. You don't have to have ambition as you run for office, but ambition really evolves with your candidacy. So there's mixed messages on that. Lack of meaningful support. Women feel that the support that they get from the party or from people is not that meaningful, and it's not the kind of support that helps them get elected. And party rules, the absence of term limits favor incumbents, as we know, and women still are underrepresented in political leadership, in legislative offices. So as a note to keep in mind that the US, as much as progress we made, we're still really below average when it comes to comparison of the US women in parliaments and OECD countries that are part of the Organization for Economic Development, highly developed countries. So we're still below the average of those OECD countries in terms of the representation of women in parliaments. So here are the research questions that we asked. What distinguishes women who persist in their quest despite of all the challenges? And what makes women drop out of the race? Do they need to develop what we call political identity? What is the anatomy of that political identity if they need it? What is it made of? Do candidates undergo an internal process or is it an external process? And what are the drivers for those political identity development? So we use two theoretical frameworks as lenses to guide our work and to inform our analyses. One is the self-determination theory, which really says that everybody, all humans, have to have these three elements to be able to operate on a high level of well-being and have a high sense of well-being and operate on a high level of performance and acquire that psychological energy that they need to perform at their very best. These three elements are autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Autonomy, or the ability to control one's decision and one's life. Competence, the feeling of self-efficacy. It doesn't really matter if you're competent in an objective manner, but it's the perception that matter. The self-efficacy, the belief that you have what it takes to succeed and to get to where you want to be. Relatedness and the ability to connect with people and to have that sense of being, have the sense that you belong there, you are authentically part of that project. So the second theoretical framework that we used is causal agency theory, which talks about people are active contributors to their, or agents of their own behavior, that if you have an agentic self, and a self that is able to plan and strategize and navigate paths, you're much more likely to be able to overcome challenges that you face. So we did 35 semi-structured interviews and two groups of female candidates who ran for political office. Half of them, or approximately half, were what we call completers. Those who have completed the race and persisted in their quest, whether they won or not. They did not drop out in the middle, but finished the race. And the other group is the non-completers who really dropped out at some point because they didn't feel that they had the autonomy, the self-efficacy to continue, the competence to carry on. We did recruitment by emails. These were in-person interviews that we have done, as well as phone interviews. And you have the demographic information here, and IRB approval was secured. The analysis design was thematic-driven, theory-driven thematic analysis. And again, feminist narrative inquiry, which really privileged the positionality and the subjectivity of the interviewees. Inductive and deductive analysis in the sense that the theoretical conceptualizations guided our analysis, and our analysis refined the theory. So we had a wide range of questions. Although most questions were open-ended, we had some that were really closed-ended, few questions that were on the Likert scale. So here is our results. Self-determination, when candidates have self-determination. Actually, I missed one slide here. Our results show that all of the candidates in our sample, all of the candidates in our study, faced challenges that came from the external environment. And there were threats on their autonomy, sense of competence, and relatedness. It's what they've done with that, with those challenges that really matter. And here is the causal agency theory. We saw that the completers really had done some identity work. They have strengthened their political behavior. And whether they lost or won, they really were able to maintain what we call political identity, a self-determined, self-directed identity. And that identity is really made up of two elements. The element that was self-determined, guarded against the threats to autonomy, competence, and relatedness, but also had that agency that challenged what is coming at them from the external environment. So women who persisted, performed conscious, I'll go back to this, I'm sorry, there was some mix-up in the slides. So self-determination plus conscious identity gave us the solidified political identity. There were clear differences between the completers and the non-completers. The completers had internal validation, which meant that they had an internal locus of control. They also had an internal regulation of action and behavior. They were autonomously driven. And they connected to a higher purpose. And that is very important for women because we're socialized to not be self-centered or self-interested. So by connecting to a higher purpose, they were able to maintain that motivation. Integration of multiple identities with political identity. So on the other hand, when you see here, the non-completers saw a tension between their role as politicians and caregivers, and they lost that identification with their quest. So the completers had assimilation of political behavior. They were able to garner political support, build wider and deeper relations that really mattered. They fundraised effectively. And I'll just go over this conclusion. So the completers, or the ones that were able to maintain a self-determined political identity, were able to identify and express themselves as political actors. What really mattered is what they've done with the external challenges, whether they allowed it to fragment their embryonic and developing political identity, or whether they really challenged what is coming at them and succeeded in turning it around and maintaining the development of their political identity. The implications is that if political identities are not static, and if we can teach women and give them the tools of maintaining that political identity and avoiding that fragmentation that can happen in the process, that is incredibly important in having more women be able to succeed in their quest for office. And our future research will focus on the process. While we said, what is the anatomy of political identity, what is it made of, we really want to look at the process by which women are able to solidify that identity and avoid it and make sure that it's not broken in the process. Thank you so much. And here's the citation as promised.
Refki. I'm an assistant professor in political science. I'm sorry I was a couple of minutes late. I have 3 excuses. So my son was home sick, so that was distracting. I also had 3:30 on my calendar, so that was my fault. And then also international events have proven a little distracting over the last couple of hours as well. But I'm really happy to be here. It's nice to see such a great turnout. Nice to see so many PhD students here, and really enjoyed those presentations. So I'll be presenting a little bit about my book, which was released last year. And what I'm going to do is, just because we only have 7 or so minutes, I'm just going to present basically the puzzle, and then urge you to buy or borrow to find out the answer. So that's a bit of a cop-out, but I was trying to think of the best way to use my 7 minutes, and so we're just going to go with that. Also happy to answer questions. My book, as mentioned, was published last year by Cambridge University Press. It's entitled Under the Gun: Political Parties and Violence in Pakistan. So since 1945, over 3,000 national elections have taken place around the world, and these have brought ordinary citizens into contact with the political process, whether that's voting for an executive figure or a legislative body. And more than half of these elections have taken place in the last 25 years alone. Unsurprisingly, therefore, the number of states that are democratic has also steadily increased. So we can see here in this graph, which uses Polity 5 data, that in 1945, less than 40% of the world's states were democratic. Today, about 65% are. So that's the good news. The bad news is that alongside this emergence and consolidation of electoral democracy, we have witnessed significant episodes of violence. So whether it is in Venezuela, in Bangladesh, in Kenya, or the Philippines, we have many examples of violence breaking out before and during elections and involving various political actors. Between 1945 and 2018, 18% of the national elections were accompanied by significant violence involving civilian deaths. So this number was magnified for new democracies, but most countries have had violence occur in at least one election. Electoral violence is now one of the most common forms of violence on the African continent. 60% of African elections between 1990 and 2008 had experienced violent intimidation or worse. And while we tend to think about violence as occurring around election time, violence involving political actors in between electoral periods is also not rare. So in Nigeria, for example, nearly half of the violence involving political parties takes place in between these electoral cycles. And so if we want to understand the general patterns of political violence and party involvement in violence, I think we have to understand these patterns. And so in my book, I use an in-depth analysis of political parties and violence in different regions of Pakistan to understand this phenomenon. And so I'm trying to understand, why is it that some political parties use violence directly or outsource the task? Why do they do it in some regions but not in others? So let me give you 4 examples, and these actually form the basis of the case studies of my book as well, and they'll give you an example of the variation that I'm trying to explain. So let's start with Karachi, which is a mega city of at least 16 million, probably closer to 20 million people. Here we have a number of different ethnic political parties who use violence directly through their own party members. One such ethnic political party has been the Muttahida Cammie movement, or the MQM. The leader of the party, Altaf Hussain, is pictured here. He himself resides in London, but is known to have provided orders directly to party members to carry out violence at his command. So a few years ago, a videotaped confession of a party member was released, in which the party member admitted to carrying out numerous murders at Altaf Hussain's orders. Also in Karachi is another political party, the Pakistan People's Party, or the PPP. The PPP is a mainstream political party. It has had federal control many times over the history of Pakistan, and it has also wielded violence in Karachi, but it hasn't done so directly. Rather, it has outsourced the task to a distinct ethnic militia known as the People's Aman Committee. So the then leader of the PPP, who's pictured here, was also president of Pakistan, is known, or at least it is alleged, that he provided orders to target, kill, or assassinate other members and residents in Karachi directly to the leader of this ethnic militia known as the People's Aman Committee. So let me take you to another province, which is Punjab. It's the country's most populous, that has 100 million people. So in this picture here, we have 2 men. The individual with the mustache was, at the time this picture was taken, a senior member of yet another mainstream political party, the Pakistan Muslim League Nawaz, or the PMLN. Seated alongside him, the individual with the gray beard continues to be the head of a banned anti-Shia militant organization, which together with its various offshoots has been responsible for the killings of thousands of Shia over the last few decades in Pakistan. So the two were seen campaigning together during a by-election in 2012. And a member of the sectarian militant group was quoted as saying that when the elections come next time, the PMLN is, quote, destined to knock at our doors once again. And then finally, let's go to the province of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, or KP. So the KP province, you may have heard of it. It is adjacent to Afghanistan and is perhaps best known for the preponderance of violence and the presence of the Pakistan Taliban. It has a large number of arms and ammunition. Despite the fact that KP is actually quite a violent province, we have a Pashtun nationalist party known as Awami National Party, which has largely refrained from violence in KP. And it refrained from violence at the same time as that it was engaging in violence in Karachi. So there's this puzzle here about why the ANP refrained from violence in KP but chose to engage in violence in Karachi. So as you can see, there's a lot of variation that needs to be explained, and my book tackles these questions. So first it asks, why do political parties pursue violence or ally with violent actors? Conventional wisdom would suggest that voters don't like violent politicians and they will punish them at the polls. And then secondly, what explains variation in the strategies of violence employed by these political parties? In order to answer these questions, I employed a multi-method research approach. So I did quite a bit of qualitative research in the country. So I spent about 22 months over the course of a decade. So this was my dissertation project. In Pakistan, at the time, I conducted 150 semi-structured interviews with party leaders, parliamentarians, party members, law enforcement officials, and journalists. I also had the opportunity to accompany members of National Assembly to their constituencies in both rural and urban settings, at which time I was able to observe interactions between the party leaders, electoral candidates, and the constituents. I also conducted some focus groups with voters. So I coupled this qualitative research with survey and survey experimental data. This included, I think, 3 surveys that I rely on. 2 of these were with voters. So the first was a face-to-face voter survey in which I had an embedded conjoint experiment of nearly 2,000 voters in 3 provinces in the country, in Sindh, Punjab, and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. The conjoint design is a little bit complicated in low literacy settings, and so what I did was I worked with the survey team to create pictorial representations of what I needed to help it to ensure understanding of everybody in the populace. I'm more than happy to talk about this in the Q&A. I also conducted, with a co-author, a voter survey of 1,800 voters in the weeks leading up to the election, and this was just in Karachi. And this was a time when issues of elections, electoral politics, and political parties are very salient in the minds of the voters. And finally, I was able to conduct a phone survey of sitting legislators, about 250, both members of national and members of provincial assembly. And then finally, I also rely on observational data. This includes both existing observational data as well as data that I collected myself. Of the data that I collected myself, it includes linkages between politicians and sectarian actors, as well as politician characteristics. And for this, I relied on secondary sources, interviews with journalists, as well as politician biographies and so on. I also, a lot of people were kind enough to share data sets with me, and this included previously unavailable exit poll data that Gallup Pakistan shared with me, as well as urban rural data that was shared by scholars at a university in Lahore. And then very importantly, I also rely heavily on secondary sources. This includes harder to find both English and Urdu language sources. Very coincidentally, about a year or 2 before I was almost finished with my book, I had a journalist reach out saying that she had 25 to 30 copies of a Pakistani magazine that she was looking to pass away along to other people, and I was like, I will take them. And they proved incredibly helpful for my revisions. And these, because there's not a really good system in Pakistan for maintaining these archives, they're definitely not available online. So I had a combination of that as well as the Library of Congress in DC. So my research allowed me to identify 3 distinct strategies of violence. The first I call direct party violence. This is in the case of the NQM the example that I gave earlier. Here, the violence specialist is intrinsic to the party apparatus. So the act of violence is determined by the political party, and the act of violence is also carried out by that same political party. This, I argue, is distinct from a process of violence outsourcing, which is the case of the PPP and the People's Amendment Committee. Here, the political party determines the type and target of violence, but the actual act of violence is carried out by a third actor, usually a criminal gang or an ethnic militia or some other sort of militant group. And then finally, I have alliance formation. So this is what I call the example of the Pakistan Muslim League Nawaz and the anti-Shia sectarian groups. Here, the political party allies with the militant group primarily for purposes of vote gain. In fact, the violence is something that is a cost to the party and that works against them, but they, for vote-getting reasons, choose to ally with the violence specialist. So again, not providing my answer why this happens. Hopefully I have piqued some interest. But I think the argument has a lot of, and the puzzle has a lot of implications for democracy. So obviously for democratic consolidation, because this intersection of violence and elections, as other scholars have noted, challenges meaningful democratization. I also argue that rather than just a lack of state capacity, party violence is rather a result of both political and economic incentives of nominally democratic actors. It also has implications for literature on party voter linkages, so why voters choose to vote for parties. So the MQM, which engaged in very high levels of violence, even had a militant wing in the heart of the city, sorry, not a militant wing, a torture cell in the heart of the city for a while, and had a very known militant wing, was an incredibly popular party for a long period of time in Karachi. So kind of examining coercive ties, but also the flip side of how parties maintain linkages despite the coercion. And then finally, state alliances with militant actors, for a large part, has been dealt with in political science from the perspective of the state, and literature in IR focuses on regional factors and the influence and increase of sectarian actors in Pakistan, but I argue that it's actually, in many ways, a perpetuation of existing local level dynamics rather than some entirely foreign or regional or international based phenomenon. So I will stop here, and I look forward